Welcome back to GLBC Connections and our new series on James. Hopefully you had the opportunity to watch Pastor John's video from this past Monday. He did a great job of introducing James and going through the first section. But if you didn't have an opportunity to watch the video, our selection today is actually going to begin with a brief review of what John covered. So let's dive right into James chapter 1, verse 12. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test or having persevered, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. James says, blessed is the one who perseveres under a trial. Remember how James began this letter. He says, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, when you face trials of many kinds. It seems odd to think about facing trials joyfully. That's not typically what we think of when we're in the middle of a trial. But James says we can consider it pure joy because of how God can work in the midst of a trial. Trials can produce perseverance, and perseverance produces Christian maturity, a maturity that seeks God's guidance, that seeks God's wisdom, that depends upon God in the midst of the trial. And so James is reiterating that point here when he says, blessed is the one who perseveres. But he adds something. He says the one who perseveres can expect a reward. And he says the reward is the crown of life. A better translation might be the crown that is life. In other words, the one who perseveres in the midst of trials will be given the gift of life. And this is so consistent with what John said on Monday, because biblically, true life, everlasting life, is an everlasting relationship with God. Again, it all comes back to our relationship with God. This is a positive outcome of facing trials. But anybody who's lived long enough knows that not all of our trials have this outcome. In fact, sometimes our trials end up pulling us away from God. And that is what James addresses beginning in verse 13. He says, when tempted, it's important to pause and make a translation note right here, because throughout the first 12 verses, James has been talking about trials. Now in verse 13, our English Bibles translate that same Greek word differently. Rather than translating it as trial, it is translated as temptation. There's good reason for changing the translation because James has changed his nuance of these trials. Rather than looking at the external trials that come our way and how God can work in the midst of those external trials, he now turns to our all too common inward reaction to these trials. And sometimes our inward reaction is to withdraw from God or even blame God. Notice what he says in verse 13. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. There's the blaming. I once had a seminary professor who talked about the human condition and how we respond to trials and temptations. And he says, since the Garden of Eden, humanity has basically had one or two reactions. The first reaction is to hide. This is what Adam and Eve did when they disobeyed God and God confronted them in the garden. They tried to hide from him. The second common reaction is to blame. We want to blame one another for the actions we've taken. We can see these two responses in little children, can't we? As you're interacting with your children or your grandchildren and they do something they shouldn't do, or even that they think they shouldn't do, it is very common that they will hide or deny or blame others. It's just a natural, common response that we have. And James is saying sometimes our inward reaction to these trials is it tempts us to withdraw from God and actually blame God. But he continues, no one should say God is tempting me, because God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. The beginning of James says God can work in the midst of trials, and he can work to draw us closer to himself. But God is not responsible for our sinful and inward reaction to these trials. God does not tempt us. In other words, God does not attempt to push us away from himself. He is not the cause of these inward reactions of rebellion and withdrawal from God. We have only ourselves to blame for those. Notice what he says in verse 14. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Notice the contrast that James is pointing. Trials come our way, and God can work in the midst of these trials when we persevere, and they lead to Christian maturity, and they actually lead to the crown of life. However, sometimes in the face of trials, our inward sinful desires take control, and they pull us away from God, cause us to sin against God, and they lead not to life, but to death. I remember once reading about Pope Gregory the Great in the 6th century, and as he talked about sin, he said there's a chain that we should think about: suggestion, desire, and consent. The suggestion are these things that we may face in life that can lead to a temptation. And we can't really control the suggestions, can we? Throughout each and every day of our lives, there will be suggestions that come our way that have the possibility of pulling us away from God, keeping us from loving God and loving others. But Gregory says suggestion often leads to a desire. And here's where our sinful impulses take over, where our evil desires, as James calls them, take over, because we start to ponder the suggestion and we start to give into the suggestion. And that giving into our own sinful desires is naturally a pulling away from God. And when we start to desire it, we usually consent to it and we give in to sin. So James is saying God can work in the midst of trials, and that can lead to life. But sometimes in the face of trials, it turns into a temptation because our evil desires, our sinful impulses take over, and we sin against God. But we can't blame God for that. We can only blame ourselves. We can only give God credit for the good things, and that's what James says in verse 16. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. God is the giver of every good thing, including the development of our maturity in the face of a trial. But we are responsible for the sinful rebellion when we encounter these things. James is setting up a contrast of how God can work in the midst of trials, and the contrast of how our own evil desires, our own sinful nature, can pull us away from God in the midst of them. I think James's point is quite clear, going back to something Pastor John said on Monday. He calls us to cry out to God, to seek God's wisdom, to seek God's guidance in the midst of these trials, because that's the only way, the only protection we have against following our own sinful nature and actually being empowered to persevere.